Louis XIV of France, known as the Sun King, is one of the most remarkable monarchs in history. The early part of Louis's reign was dominated by Cardinal Mazarin, his chief minister, much as we have seen with his predecessor, Louis XIII, and Cardinal Richelieu. With the death of Mazarin in 1661, Louis began his personal rule of France and was absolute monarch for the next 54 years, a total reign of 72 years, dominating the 17th century, which is sometimes referred to as the age of Louis XIV. During his long reign, Louis greatly increased French influence in the world, while domestically promoting the crown as an absolute monarchy and extending its authority over the church and aristocracy. And yet, Louis XIV is regarded by many to have been an authoritarian and heartless king. Certainly he was a generous patron and protector of the arts, supporting writers, painters, and musicians such as Molière, Lebrun, and Lully. He converted a hunting lodge built by his predecessor into the spectacular Palace of Versailles. With regard to marriage and family, in 1660 Louis married Maria Theresa, eldest daughter of the Spanish king Philip IV. The royal couple had 6 children, but only one child, Louis, known as the Grand Dauphin, officially survived to adulthood. The designation official is important because one of their daughters may have lived to adulthood in a convent and herself produced a royal child fathered by James II, future King of England, a dark tale indeed. We will revisit this bit of conspiracy theory momentarily. Louis XIV was not faithful to Maria Theresa, taking a series of mistresses, both official and unofficial, producing numerous illegitimate offspring. And it is a reincarnational connection with one of Louis's mistresses that leads us to a man identified by Cayce as having been Louis XIV in a past life. Curiously, the reading for this man was not a life reading, rather a physical reading given on May 29, 1941, for a car salesman experiencing loss of vision. The reading contained typical Cayce diagnosis and treatment recommendations, spinal adjustments and electrotherapy, with a simple yet evocative phrase near the end of the reading. Much might be given as to latent abilities. In the readings, latent abilities usually refers to innate urges or tendencies associated with past lives, which are discussed in life readings. But this man did not request a life reading and actually never followed the recommendations in his physical reading. Interestingly, his ex-wife received 4 life readings that indicated a past life in France as a consort to King Louis XIV, who was her husband in the 20th century. One of the readings noted that she had been recruited for her special relationship to the monarch by lobbyists of the king's court. The relationship raised questions, and although the series of readings for this woman never used the term mistress, the nature of the relationship as described was rather obvious. So much so, in a later mental spiritual reading, the woman asked if she had been Louise de la Vallière, one of the prominent mistresses of Louis XIV. Cayce's reply was that since it was not a life reading, the specific reincarnational information requested wasn't available. Unfortunate from the standpoint of our curiosity, but that's just how Cayce's psychic process worked. Certainly the life of Louise de la Vallière parallels very closely much of the information provided in the readings for this woman. In that French incarnation, she started out as a sincere, religious young lady who got caught up in selfishness, felt guilty, and made efforts to change. The change was ultimately the taking of vows in a convent, which was also the choice made by Louise de la Vallière. In terms of modern life implications, just as King Louis had enticed his famous mistress out of the convent to resume their relationship in France, so her ex-husband was making overtures and attracting her attention. One of her readings simply counseled, "Do not fool thine own self." In other words, you have been down that path before. Don't make the same mistake again. Another case that is probably associated with one of Louis's mistresses is revealed in a reading for a 38-year-old woman that described a past life as Louisa, a daughter of Louis XIV. The reading cited disappointments in that experience, leading to a life in a convent at age 20. In terms of soul development, she did gain in the latter portion of that sojourn by giving much to others. She carried over into her modern life an innate feeling that the strong should give to the weak, and a desire for love sought in that French life that was never satisfied. The court of Louis XIV included the brightest and most creative people in France, as noted in a reading for an 8-month-old baby boy that described a past life as the great French dramatist Jean Poquelin, who used the stage name Molière. Curiously, the baby had been born with a physical deformity of the lip and palate that his reading insisted was not so much karma as simply a physical accident associated with the gestation of the fetus. What he did carry over from that famous past life in France as Molière was a tendency, even as a child, to be precise about furniture arrangements in a room, and an interest in music and dramatic art, and especially a close, clinging relationship to his mother, who died when he was young during his past life as Molière. His 20th-century parents were told that he would be one to ask a lot of questions, and they should be prepared to answer quickly as best they could, for he will always have an answer for any question. Thus he should be trained in psychology and the use of the mind in philosophizing. Of course, not all the individuals with readings that indicated past lives associated with Louis XIV were famous. For example, a reading for a 37-year-old bookkeeper described a past life as Doran, an armed guard at the official residence of Louis XIV during the early portion of that monarch's reign. Doran felt overpowered by the experience of court life in that environment, bringing forward into his modern incarnation a desire to form close relationships, yet slow to make new friends. A reading for a 51-year-old woman described a past life as a maid or lady-in-waiting in the court of Louis XIV. In that experience, due to her associations and the nature of that environment, she had a great deal of knowledge of activities and entanglements of many in the court. She carried over into her modern life a knowledge of dresses, and was particularly affected by dresses or costumes that were white and mauve, and certain shades of royal purple. As we conclude this brief reincarnational exploration of the life and times of Louis XIV, we shall return to that bit of conspiracy theory that we mentioned earlier. In contrast to mainstream history, the Cayce readings indicate that the second daughter of Louis XIV and his wife, Maria Theresa, did not die soon after birth, but rather lived to be an adult, spent much of her life in a convent, and bore a son fathered by James II, the Duke of York, who eventually became King of England. The royal love child only lived for 5 years and died under mysterious circumstances, apparently murdered to prevent his claims to the throne, that is, the King of France and/or the King of England. After all, both his parents would have been of high royal blood. The plot thickens when we learn that the ill-fated love child was a past life of Edgar Cayce. Now that we have laid out the bare essentials of the story, let's take a deeper cut and examine some details. First of all, could a legitimate daughter of Louis XIV have survived to adulthood? Curiously, there are several historical sources that indicate that the second daughter of the royal couple, Marie Anne, may not have died soon after birth as the official record states, but that having been born with very dark skin, she was taken away and a false death statement was issued. Keep in mind that both the king and queen carried some distant Mediterranean blood that tended toward darker olive-colored skin. Louis XIV is said to have even had some Moorish features. Queen Maria Theresa of Spain would likely have had some Moorish heritage in her family tree that could manifest as dark skin in an offspring. Understandably, the appearance of impropriety could have produced a strong reaction by the king, perhaps even secretly sending the child away. And there are multiple historical accounts that describe a dark-skinned nun living in a convent, who, some assert, was just such a daughter of Louis XIV and Maria Therese, sometimes called the Black Nun of Moray. If we accept the possibility that the dark-skinned baby, Marie Anne, in fact survived childhood, the next question is whether the timeline for an adult affair with James II is plausible. The readings state that the king's daughter, called Gracia, had the affair with James II when she was 17 years old. If we assume that Maria Anne was the king's daughter who lived to be an adult, as given in the readings, James II would have had to been in France within a specific time frame to be available for an affair. It so happens that James II toured Europe in 1681 when Marie Anne would have been 17 years old. At that time, he would have been married to Mary of Modena, while simultaneously having an affair with Catherine Sedley, who bore him 2 children between 1681 and 1684. James II is recorded as having sired 21 children, of which 15 were legitimate by his 2 wives, and 6 were illegitimate by his 2 mistresses. So James was not bashful about sex and procreation, within the sanctity of marriage or not. Perhaps he could have been tempted by a beautiful, dark-skinned daughter of a French king. Yes, the readings do insist that the king's daughter was beautiful, and is also noted in some of the historical accounts surrounding the Black Nun of Moray. As with all reincarnational historical accounts, the ultimate value is not a game of trivial pursuit or idle curiosity. It is in the potential for soul development within a greater context of multiple incarnations of soul groups. So it is with this sad account of a royal love child murdered in infancy. The readings insist on linking Cayce's brief French incarnation to previous incarnations in ancient Egypt and Persia, in which he created the karmic patterns that he would later meet. In Egypt, as the high priest Ra-Ta, he had indulged himself in an illicit affair with a royal dancer, producing a love child that died at about 4 years of age. The king had become jealous of the affair, sentenced both parents to exile, but insisted that the child remain in Egypt, where it soon died of neglect. That Egyptian child was a past life of the Louis XIV daughter described in the readings. So royal father and daughter in Egypt reincarnate as royal mother and son in France, where both children die young due to the whims of a king. Another interesting factor in this case, if we accept the plausibility of Marie Anne being a dark-skinned daughter of Louis XIV, is that Ra-Ta in that Egyptian incarnation had mistakenly undertaken a program of eugenics to breed a perfect white-skinned race. Thus, the white-skinned priest and his perfect white-skinned love child in ancient Egypt are reincarnated as dark-skinned princess and dark-skinned royal love child in the reign of Louis XIV. Furthermore, there is Cayce's Persian incarnation where his companion was that same entity who would become his mother in France. The Persian incarnation concluded when he was betrayed and beheaded, all the while harboring negative thoughts and feelings for his assassins. More karma to be met, and apparently it was met in that shortened life as a royal love child in France. I warned you that there would be some darkness carried forward into the reign of Louis XIV, a sad reflection on the Sun King. Especially so because the readings suggest that Louis XIV may have been involved in the murder of his own grandson, and that moral darkness continued into the reign of his successor, Louis XV.